What I also found really interesting, I mean, I was telling you this on the phone before we picked up. I mean, this I was surprised because I just wasn't anticipating a sort of a story. I mean, there's a sort of like an Aaron Brockovich quality to
Yeah.
this, and it's about, these are real people who are suffering through things, and in some ways this becomes an obsession for them that it
Hmm.
also creates havoc amongst their family.
Absolutely.
With that said, what I really loved about this is there were things that I have sort of had a vague understanding about, but that I became much clearer to me, and like sort of how this happened. And I want you to talk about the development, I think it was, of CDOs, because
Hmm.
it really captured to me what was driving so much of all of this financialization is not like a big scheme. It's generally just one guy figuring how they can overcome the obstacles. Like it's a salesman, basically, figuring out how they can overcome the obstacles to selling something to somebody else
Right.
by that person's like concerns. I mean, the quality of it
Yeah.
to me reminds me of like the way that I've built these offices here, where it's just like I put this layer of duct tape on here and this is attached to this. And when it's time to move, I realize like, oh my God, how could there be so much layered crap everywhere? And that's what this seems to be. Like there's no grand scheme here. It's just one guy, somebody saying like, I'm a little nervous about buying that security. Well, let me come up with a way that makes you less nervous. I mean,
Right. Right.
discuss the
Yeah.
development of the CDO in that way.
So that's kind of chapter two, and the one guy you're talking about is Lou Ranieri, and he ran the mortgage trading desk at Solomon Brothers. And if your listeners want a much longer and more detailed treatment of that, get Liar's Poker, which was Michael Lewis's first book from his time at Solomon Brothers, and it goes into the entire history of Lou Ranieri, who was this guy who ran the mortgage trading desk there, and he figured out how to turn mortgages into a tradable instrument, basically. He realized that the mortgage market was the largest market in the world. The U.S. residential housing market is the largest market in the world, and that Wall Street wanted to play in it, that they wanted a piece of it. And at that time, they didn't have a piece of it because the only people that had a secondary market that was trading mortgages were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And they traded very safe, conforming 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, and there were laws really prohibiting private entities from doing that. And so he decided a couple things. Number one, he wanted to redesign the mortgage security into a CMO, a collateralized mortgage obligation. And in doing that, he created this system where people didn't have to take any more risk than they wanted. If they wanted a safe mortgage bond, they would get the senior tranche. So there were different levels of risk, which they called tranches. And there was the senior tranche, the mezzanine tranche, and the equity tranche. And the lower you went on that scale, the more risk you took that the monthly payment wouldn't come in, and you would get shortchanged on your payments. But basically, when all the revenue came in, when all the monthly payments came in, the senior tranche would get paid out first, and then the mezzanine would get whatever was left. And then if there was left over from that, the equity tranche would get what was left there. And so it allowed people to have sort of a defined sense of what they were getting. You would get a higher interest rate at the higher risk levels, but you would have more risk of getting repaid. So this meant that you didn't have to worry about, whether that guy in Albuquerque, whether he could afford his mortgage or not. All you had to worry about was that you were taking a certain level of risk and getting a certain level of interest for it. So he redesigned the mortgage security. And then what Ranieri did is he went about legalizing it. He got the law changed through the Reagan administration, through the Carter administration. He got the law changed so that you could trade these mortgage-backed securities on a mass scale in every state as long as you got a rating organization to bless them and say that they were highly rated.
It's
As long
so
as you got that, anyone could buy them, including institutional investors like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and things like that.
It's so insane because it's like literally like having a car dealership and knowing that like I've got 100 cars here and I have reason to believe that 15 of them will explode at one point during. But
Right.
what we're going to
But
do
if I
is
diversify the risk.
well, but
then
if I say to
doesn't
people
matter.
like, look, I'm going to give you, you're going to pay the super discounted rate. That means
Right.
that there's a 1 in 2 chance you're going to get an exploded car,
Right.
or you can pay a
Well,
premium rate and you'll get a car that won't explode. I mean,
and then what was crazier is that they could sell that senior tranche, no problem, because it was lower risk. They had problems selling the mezzanine and equity tranches. So here's what they did. They took back those lower tranches, and they made new securities based on that, retranching them and saying, this is a security made up of this other security, but the top tranche will get paid off first. So they turned crap into AAA rated senior mortgage bonds. And they did this over and over and over again. They would just sort of julienne these things and mash up the worst bits of the other securities that they couldn't sell and magically, through alchemy, change them into good bits again.
well, was that because that ratings in that situation become just relative? I mean, it's sort of like you're taking the cream is rising to the top. You skim that off, and you take what's ever left, and then you just wait for whatever barely rises to the top. There is that basically it. Like it's all relative. The premium of the crap.
It was somewhat relative, and it was also the fact that the rating agencies are deeply corrupt, and that they would rate anything, because the business model was that the issuer paid for the rating. So you're not going to give a bank a bad rating on their structured product if it meant that you wouldn't get more things to rate later on down the line. And there's a scene in The Big Short which basically says exactly that. So it was about corruption at the rating agencies. It was about the corruption of their compensation model, which is an interesting thing because you see that down the line here. That there was the compensation models incentivized bad outcomes for people. That was certainly true with the rating agencies, and that was true with the mortgage servicing industry. So when all these mortgages were bought and sold and sent into bonds all over the country, somebody had to be the company that took the monthly payments and did day-to-day operations with the borrowers, and those are called mortgage servicing companies. And their compensation model lends towards foreclosure and lends towards putting people into default rather than helping people get through their loans. So this is a complete inversion of the old mortgage industry where the bank, the local community bank, held your loan, right, and if you got in trouble, it was in their interest to fix it so that you could stay in your house. Now we had a model where the risk was passed around like a hot potato all the way to, somebody owns a piece of your loan in Norway and somebody owns it in Indiana, and there's a mortgage servicing company whose compensation is based on two things. One, the unpaid principal balance. They get a percentage of that on your loan, so they'll never cut your principal because that's cutting their own fee. Number two, it's based on whatever fees they can generate that they get to keep, and they actually get all those fees paid back if there's a foreclosure. So this creates an undeniable incentive to give late fees, to give default fees, to give management fees, and to put you into foreclosure because the mortgage servicing company gets paid off first in a foreclosure. So
and they set up.
There's a lot to be said about these underlying mismatched incentives that produce bad outcomes for homeowners.
And it's clear from your story and the sort of the just the timeline and the different stages throughout this, that those entities are not just waiting for their the homeowners to screw up, right? Like they were pretty active. They're actively trying to create roadblocks that would push people into situations where there's late fees. Go ahead.
It was called servicer-driven default, and you saw it over and over again. Going back to the 80s, I mean, I tell this story about this guy, Nye Laval, who's this kind of mythical character who ran a sports marketing agency. He was a pretty well-off guy and got involved with this mortgage in the late 1980s and ended up going on a 10 to 12-year crusade trying to fight this foreclosure. And it was all based on that mortgage servicing company just dialing up fees and continuing to bash this particular property with different fees. And he figured all this stuff out years and years, and he actually warned Fannie and Freddie. He became a shareholder in he would buy single shares of all these banking companies and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and he would go to the shareholder meetings and tell them there's something terrible happening, and what you're doing is absolutely fraudulent, and you need to fix your processes. And Fannie Mae actually checked it out, and they came up with this. They had an outside law firm look into his claims, and that law firm said, yeah, this guy's right. Everything he said is actually happening, but what they conclude is that they don't think homeowners will have the resources available to fight foreclosure cases at a large enough scale for this to be cost-effective to fix. It was similar to like the Ford Pinto memo, where in the 70s, the Ford Pintos were exploding if you touched the bumper. And Ford said, well, rather than redesign the assembly line, we'll just pay people off one at a time, and that will be more cost-effective for us as a corporation. That's essentially what Fannie Mae said. They saw all of this coming, and this outside law firm said it will be more cost-effective for you to just pay off the few people that challenge their foreclosure cases than to actually fix the system. It's an incredible moment. And so this has been going on for decades. And the sad thing is it continues to this very day.
Yeah, you've got a piece up at The Intercept to that effect. So from a reform standpoint, I mean, and again, like there was so many instances where there's just like petty rip-off scam stuff. Like, half this stuff just sort of feels like, like phishing, scams that you would see online, just sort of just like unbelievable.
Well, it's because every little company that was part of what I call in the book the Great Foreclosure Machine, every little part of it wanted to get their piece of the action.
Right.
And so you have these law firms, which were called foreclosure mills, because they would go through foreclosures like a sweater mill would knit sweaters or something. There were these companies that were subcontracted to do inspections on properties and to, quote-unquote, trash out abandoned properties, which they frequently got the address wrong and would trash out the wrong property of someone who had no problem with their loan. Or they would trash out places that weren't abandoned yet. You had these companies that were contracted to deliver notice, like a summons of foreclosure to people who fell into this, and they would do a thing called sewer service, where they would just throw it in the gutter, and they could do it a lot more quickly that way. And they also ensured that the individual had no idea that there was a foreclosure on their property. There were all these petty scams that did go on, and they continue to go on, really. But I want to make one thing clear, because we've talked about a lot of somewhat technical stuff here.
The book is not like that.
The book is not like that. This is a story about people who are thrust into this extraordinary situation and what they do and how they sacrifice everything else in their lives to expose this giant secret about what Wall Street has wrought, and they become successful to a degree in doing that. And the story is really about people who have no institutional knowledge or resources, and they go up against the most powerful institution in America, and they get on the brink of success. And the other question in the book is reckoning with why they weren't ultimately more successful, and why Washington and Wall Street sort of colluded at the end to make sure there were limited consequences for any of this, and what that means about our society, our justice system, our the level of accountability in society, and things like that. So it's really that kind of a book. The highly complex mortgage transactions are sort of off to one side.
Yes, and I apologize for focusing on that, but I have to say the way you presented it was really I found it incredibly digestible, that part of it. Let me ask you this about and this specifically is about Lisa and Michael, two of the protesters. Do you think they have regrets? I mean, in terms of like just how deep they got into this. I mean, because relative to somebody who would have just said, screw it, and I'll just get,
right.
I'll just lose what I shouldn't be losing at this point, and just cut my losses because he can't fight City Hall.
Yeah, I don't think they regret the fact that they, in their small way, helped people. I mean, the fact that they now work for a local law firm in South Florida trying to help homeowners fight foreclosure cases one at a time tells me that they don't regret, the expertise that they gained and the work that they did. It was really as much about comforting and sort of caring for other people in foreclosure as it was about their own cases. It was about helping people, and I think they were really transformed by that. Particularly Michael Redman, who was someone who was not someone who would go out of his way to help others, I think, by his own admission. Prior to this situation, the obsession that he had with this foreclosure fraud really changed sort of the person that he is in many ways. So, I don't think they regret it. I do think that they used to think that they would expose this and that somebody would step in, someone in authority, and come up with a reasonable solution that would punish the wrongdoers and create a sustainable way for people to stay in their homes. And I'm pretty certain that they don't think that anymore. And so if that's a regret, then they have that.
All right. Lastly, what was there anything that really shocked you? I mean, you went into this knowing a lot of the basic, or I mean, even more beyond the basic outlines of this. Was there anything that sort of shocked you over the course of writing the book?
One thing that did shock me was sort of the level of, when you're dealing with whistleblowers, they're sort of somewhat paranoid to begin with. They do. I write in the preface that every whistleblower is sort of a little bit crazy. They see these conspiracies and things. What shocked me was the level to which that played out, and things that were checkable that did actually happen. Lynn Simoniak she had her car robbed on her driveway. And they were rifling through stuff. She would hear clicks. I heard from all these people that they would hear clicks on the phone on the line as if someone else was listening into them. More foreclosure defense attorneys would tell me about their offices being ransacked. Lynn Simoniak was on a plane. This is one of the more interesting scenes in the book. She was coming back from talking to a U.S. attorney in, I believe, South Carolina. She was going back home to West Palm Beach, which is where the story takes place in Florida. And she's on this plane, and this is before she's ever filed a lawsuit against any bank or anything like that. And she's on the plane, and she's next to a guy, and she goes over to get the in-flight magazine, and the guy leans in and says, "You know what happens to people that sue banks?" And she said, "What?" And he said, "They end up dead." And he never talked to her again. And this was sort of confirmed that she told this at the time to a bunch of other people. She had not been a public figure in terms of publicly, presenting a case anywhere at this point. She had just been talking to federal law enforcement officials at this point. So it's unclear how anyone would even know that she was preparing to sue banks, let alone was doing so. And so that was really, really kind of made me uneasy when I was going into this. And I didn't know a lot of that stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, there was. You didn't experience any of that, did you?
No, not personally. But I mean, it did spill out. There's a very mysterious suicide in this book by one of the key witnesses, a low-level employee that used to forge documents in mortgage documents in cases. There's some bizarre stuff in here that goes beyond just sort of the usual kind of lobbying and cover-ups that you might see in other corporate crime cases.
The book is Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. It really does read like a novel. And David, it's a great accomplishment. I'm very happy for you. And I know it's going to be successful. I've already won an award. I won an award before it even came out.
Well, that was the publisher gave that award, but it's the Studs and Ida Turkle Prize, and I'm humbled by being put in the same category as Studs Turkle, as someone I admired. I should say I'm also if anyone's in Los Angeles, I'm actually speaking tonight about Chain of Title at the West LA Democratic Club, which is it's at St. Bede's Episcopal Church in Mar Vista. It's on Grandview Boulevard, and you can sort of look that up for the details. I have a Facebook page for the book, and all the details are there.
We'll link on that.
It's facebook.com/chainoftitleBook.
And that's where people can find out, like, where your other speaking...
Right.
Okay.
That's correct. I'll be in D.C., I'll be in San Francisco, I'll be in New York, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, and that's so far.
All right, folks. Can't recommend the book highly enough. David Dayen, thanks so much for coming on.
All right, thanks a lot.
Hello, you. I'm Sam Cedar. Looking for smart progressive talk that is occasionally amusing? Well, subscribe to our YouTube feed. Subscribe to our podcast. Like us on Facebook. And just generally enjoy us.